Welcome to Noir channel. We are about to present to you Kare-Kare for a Clairvoyant, a traditional murder mystery story. Enjoy! Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the Datai's main pavilion, turning the Langkawi rainforest into a blurred tapestry of emerald and charcoal. Sherlock Holmes stood by the entrance, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the warm amber glow spilling from the lobby. He watched the water sheet down the panes with an intensity that suggested he was reading a coded message in the droplets rather than merely observing weather. Dr. Watson adjusted his collar, feeling the humidity settle against his shirt like a damp compress, a stark contrast to the dry air of London they had left behind mere hours before. The scent of wet earth and blooming frangipani drifted through the open-air corridors, mingling with the faint aroma of lemongrass tea from the lounge. Inside, the resort hummed with a low-key energy that felt curated rather than accidental. Puan Sharifa Norizan BTD. Zulkifli moved behind the reception desk with the fluid precision of someone who had memorized every guest's preference before they arrived. She greeted them not as strangers, but as expected variables in her daily equation, offering a polite nod without breaking her flow of typing on a sleek holographic interface. Nearby, Florian Wessels sat at a low table, his field tablet glowing softly as he reviewed spectral images of the canopy walkway. He looked up when Holmes approached, jaw loose but watchful, a man measuring threat before deciding none existed, then dropped his gaze back to the screen where data points mapped the forest's breathing patterns. Watson engaged him in conversation about the local ecology, asking simple questions that forced Florian to explain complex root systems and bird migration routes with deliberate care. The naturalist spoke slowly, choosing each word as if testing its weight against the scale of truth. "The dipterocarp roots go deep," he said, tapping the screen where red lines indicated soil saturation levels. "They hold the hillside together even when the monsoon hits hard." Holmes listened in silence, his gray eyes tracking the way Florian's fingers trembled slightly before settling on the glass surface of his device. Later that evening, they found themselves in a quiet corner of the lounge where Sylvester Chua sat nursing an iced tea. He wore a linen suit that looked expensive but unobtrusive, watching the room with the practiced invisibility of a man who spent his life managing other people's fortunes. When Holmes introduced himself, Sylvester offered a brief smile that did not reach his eyes. "A pleasure," he said, his tone smooth and modulated. "I hope your stay is restorative." He glanced toward the glass walls, where the rain continued its steady percussion against the jungle below. Holmes accepted a cup of tea from a passing server, noting how the steam curled upward in thin, erratic spirals before vanishing into the humid air. The conversation remained light, circling around wellness retreats and the benefits of disconnecting from digital networks for a week. Yet beneath the polite exchange lay an undercurrent of observation that neither man could ignore. Watson watched Sylvester's hands as they rested on the table, noting the slight tension in his knuckles whenever the topic shifted toward local business interests. As night deepened and the rain slowed to a steady drizzle, Holmes and Watson settled into their assigned villas. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of sandalwood incense that lingered from earlier cleaning cycles. Holmes sat by the window, watching the silhouette of the forest against the moonlit sky. Watson unpacked his medical kit on the desk nearby. They had not yet discussed why they were truly there, though unspoken questions pressed against the quiet between them. The resort slept around them, a scatter of lights through the trees like embers sunk into dark water. Somewhere in the distance, a hornbill called out, its voice echoing off the wet leaves before fading into the darkness. Holmes turned from the window, his face catching the soft glow of his device as he began to cross-reference guest arrival logs with local news feeds. Watson watched him work for a moment, then picked up a pen and opened a fresh notebook, ready to document whatever came next. Tomorrow would bring interviews and investigations. Tonight belonged only to the rain and the quiet weight of two men who understood that stillness rarely announced the trouble already moving beneath it. Rain hammered the launch hull as it cut through the swell toward the Datai's jetty, turning the Langkawi sunset into a bruised smear of violet and charcoal. A young staff member in understated livery stepped forward before they could set foot on the dock, affixing matte black biosensor medallions to their wrists and explaining that the resort's wellness, AI monitored proximity and biometric data continuously, updating every 4 seconds with no option for opt-out during the stay. Holmes examined his device for a full 10 seconds without expression, then slid it onto his wrist where it clicked into place with a mechanical finality. No comment. Watson watched the rain sheet off the open-air pavilions connected by elevated canopy walkways, noting how sensor nodes sat flush against every structural junction like unblinking eyes. Above the storm noise, the PA system chimed softly to announce that Tropical Storm Ria had been upgraded and would close the Geopark Road at midnight. The main terrace held a pre-dinner gathering where Marisol Aquino Reyes commanded attention in ivory silk, an amber brooch pinned to her lapel like a large coin. She leaned toward Florian Wessels, who stood with the particular stillness of old money and silver hair, and told him his new acquisition was heavier than its provenance suggested. The Swiss naturalist's smile calcified instantly. He stared at her hands as if they held something dangerous. Marisol drifted to Datuk Razif bin Haron next, offering a formal greeting that lingered one beat past courtesy before she remarked on how remarkable the amber light here was. A muscle tightened along Razif's jaw, though his face remained a mask of patrician composure, while Dr. Priya Anand appeared at Marisol's elbow and redirected her toward the wellness briefing table with smooth deliberation. Sylvester Chua tried twice to pull Marisol into a private corner near the service doors, but she deflected him each time with bright Tagalog phrases Watson could not catch from across the room. Holmes stood by the terrace rail nursing sparkling water, cataloging every shift in posture and every glance exchanged between the guests as the storm darkened the sky behind them. Dinner arrived on isolated trays marked with green allergen flags to separate Marisol's Kare-Kare from all communal dishes. She ate slowly, performing for the room. At 6:41 p.m., she paused mid-sentence and touched her throat with a sudden, jerky motion. The color drained from her lips with a speed Watson recognized viscerally as anaphylactic shock. He was on his feet before thought caught up with action, finding the auto-injector in her bag and driving it against her thigh through the fabric of her dress. He depressed the plunger once. No hiss came. He bore down on it a second time while Marisol's breathing narrowed to a thread, her eyes finding his and carrying an expression he would not write down in any notebook before she went still at 7:04 p.m. Razif watched with absolute composure that felt rehearsed rather than natural, while Priya's hands shook as she reached for the injector. Holmes stepped into her path and redirected her gently toward a chair. Watson crouched beside Marisol and, tilting the injector under his penlight, worked the cap loose with a dinner knife. The fluid inside was clear with no yellow tinge or epinephrine odor, and when he weighed the cartridge in his palm against memory, it felt 6 grams too light for a standard fill. Fresh score marks marred the biometric seal on the casing, clean cuts consistent with a thin polymer instrument of exactly 2.3 millimeter width. He looked up to find Holmes already watching him from across the sealed room where Ahmad Fadzila had just finished locking down the dining area. "This is saline," Watson murmured, low enough for Holmes alone. "It's been replaced. She never had a chance. She never had a chance." Dawn broke over Langkawi with a bruised sky and rain hammering the bamboo screens of Marisol's villa. Watson knelt beside the still form on the bed, his movements precise as he calibrated a digital caliper against the abrasion marks on her arm. The measurements registered 2.3 millimeters, consistent with a thin polymer instrument rather than a fingernail or standard key. He dipped a paper strip into the reservoir of the empty auto-injector cartridge found in her handbag. The reagent remained colorless, confirming sterile saline where epinephrine should have been. Watson photographed the result against his measuring scale before sealing the evidence bag. Across the room, Holmes stood by the biometric lock on the front door, his wristband terminal glowing with a soft blue light as he accessed Ahmad's admin credentials. The event log displayed a single clean entry at 3017 p.m., devoid of alarm flags or override notations. Someone had opened that door with an authorized credential, and the system recorded it without hesitation. The kitchen smelled of coconut oil and damp earth when they entered the allergen preparation station with Ahmad Fadzila in tow. A sealed jar of Annatto coconut oil sat on the isolated counter, its green designation strip intact and Marisol's name printed clearly on the label. Watson leaned over the opened container, inhaling slowly for any chemical off-note. The scent was purely aromatic spices and fat, nothing adulterated. Holmes moved to Chef Nalini Ravindran's personal station drawer, dragging it open on its tracks with a dry metallic scrape that died against the steel countertops and grease-dulled extraction hood. He withdrew a narrow filleting blade used specifically for herb work and set it on the counter's edge. Watson swabbed the steel near the bolster where handle met blade and applied a colorimetric strip for shrimp protein. 90 seconds passed before a faint but unambiguous pink line developed. Nalini arrived moments later, summoned from staff quarters, her face flushing as she saw the test result. Chef Ravindran's distress was immediate and physical, her hands trembling as she gestured at the stainless steel counters. She insisted her station remained allergen certified under strict resort audit protocols. That knife had never touched bagoong or shrimp paste, not once. The drawer had been locked since yesterday's lunch prep, she claimed, her voice rising with genuine panic before dropping to a whisper in which she pleaded the integrity of her kitchen. Holmes watched her hands closely. They were shaking not from guilt, but from the terror of being accused of negligence that could end her career. He asked no second question, and Ahmad looked on with quiet concern as her words fell away into silence. The evidence pointed toward sabotage within the kitchen walls, yet Nalini's specific denial felt too precise to be fabricated. Datuk Razif bin Harun appeared in the doorway of the manager's office before Holmes could request an interview, adjusting the cuff of his silk shirt with the unhurried ease of a man who expected to be waited for. He stated that he had been in the reading lounge from approximately 2:45, finding the monsoon light there useful for extended reading during the storm. His account arrived with measured calm, no defensiveness, no impulse toward the elaboration that usually accompanied such scrutiny. Holmes thanked him, then turned back to Ahmad Fadzila at the admin dashboard terminal where a 3D heat map of guest positions glowed in layered colors. Holmes asked quietly whether a dormant wellness AI session token from a prior authenticated user could be reused to query current medical profiles without triggering a new login flag in the audit record. Ahmad paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, and admitted uncertainty about that specific architectural quirk. Holmes wrote the question down in his narrow leather notebook while Caspian Yo worked silently at a terminal near the office doorway, running routine system diagnostics on the resort network. The satellite uplink tone dropped out mid-cycle, a soft chime pulsing from every medallion worn by staff and guests alike. The admin display froze for 2 seconds before restoring itself on local cache, the heat map blinking back to life as if nothing had happened. Holmes did not look away from the screen as he asked Ahmad whether the raw backup buffer was stored separately from the display layer. Ahmad confirmed that yes, the system logged both independently in different directories. Holmes turned toward the doorway, where Caspian Yo had been standing just 30 seconds ago. The young man was gone, no footsteps, no creak of a door hinge. Ensure no one performs maintenance on the system logs until I have reviewed them, Holmes said, his voice perfectly level. He looked at Watson, who stared at the empty space by the door. Ahmad stood by the door. Holmes lifted Marisol's meditation bag, his long fingers testing its weight against what the visible contents should have yielded. The fabric was heavy at the base, dense where there should have been only air and loose linens. Watson moved to the bathroom wall with his camera raised, capturing macro details of the biometric lock panel's exterior. He noted faint abrasion marks around the sensor rim, consistent with a synthetic overlay applied recently enough to leave residue, but old enough to be nearly invisible without magnification. Holmes pressed his thumb into the bag's base. The seam gave. A false-bottomed compartment revealed itself, silk-lined and empty save for a single object, an amber brooch that seemed to hold its own light in the gray storm room. Watson took the piece carefully and placed it under the beam of his forensic UV pen. The violet glow coaxed an inscription from the resin, 4 lines of dense script that twisted into shapes Watson could not place. Holmes watched without blinking, then reached for a sterile evidence bag. Watson capped the pen and passed the brooch across. "It is not merely jewelry," Holmes said, sealing the bag with a precise fold. The weight distribution was deliberate concealment. Near the door, Ahmad shifted his stance and checked his watch, a nervous twitch that betrayed his impatience for the storm to pass so they could leave the room behind. Dr. Priya Anand arrived at 10:14, her resort medallion logging the entry before she even crossed the threshold into the sitting area. She was composed, but her eyes darted immediately toward Marisol's laptop bag on the table rather than the space where the woman had died hours earlier. Holmes ushered her to a chair near the window, while Watson resumed his documentation of the lock panel. Asked when she had last seen Marisol alive, Priya answered with precise intervals that felt rehearsed for an audience. She described herself as a professional manager who had coordinated this retreat to secure funding for coral surveys in Datai Bay. Holmes pressed her on why such coordination required physical presence if remote work was standard practice. The questions sat between them unanswered until she admitted that the threats Marisol received before arriving had referenced specific document titles from encrypted notes. Her composure cracked as she realized what that admission implied about how the sender had obtained those internal files. "The data suggests someone had access to her local cache," Priya said, shifting in her seat and looking to Watson for validation he did not give. She stopped then, realizing too late that naming the breach was a confession of vulnerability rather than an explanation. Watson stepped out onto the terrace where the rain hammered against the glass roof in gray curtains. Florian Wessels stood in the downpour, his dress shirt drenched and clinging to shoulders that slumped under a weight no storm could explain. The naturalist stared up at the canopy, as if reading messages written in the swaying leaves of the dipterocarp trees above. Watson approached without announcing himself, stopping just within earshot while the wind tore at their clothes. Florian spoke first about Marisol being the only person who understood what the order required of its affiliated witnesses. When Watson mentioned the brooch found inside the bag, Florian closed his eyes against the rain. He spoke with deliberate care. "It was an acknowledgement token," he said, "bestowed by the Order of the Amber Throne upon someone who had either served the organization irreversibly or seen it clearly enough to become dangerous." "I do not know which category she occupied," he admitted, his voice rough with a fatigue that went deeper than sleeplessness. He turned and walked back inside without looking at Watson, leaving the door open to the storm. Holmes approached Ahmad in the entryway where the air smelled of wet wood and ozone. He asked about the contact tracing system's raw backup buffer, the unprocessed proximity log underlying the resort's cleaned dataset available for public viewing. Ahmad confirmed It existed as a local right before normalization, but stated that access required formal data governance approval through the resort AI. A 12-hour minimum delay stood between them and the truth of who walked where when Caspian Yo had vanished from the office earlier that day. Holmes nodded once, thanked him by name, and asked Watson to note the exact timestamp of the request. Watson checked his watch and recorded 10:51 a.m. as the moment they formally requested access to a system that might already be scrubbed clean. Holmes held the sealed evidence bag up to the light one final time, then slid it into his jacket pocket. The inscription's 4 lines matched a cipher he recognized from a deposition draft filed with a Manila NGO years ago, never transmitted, and now resurfacing here. Across the room, Watson switched off his UV pen and the villa's interior returned to gray stormlight. He waited for more explanation. None came. The amber brooch sat sealed in an evidence pouch on the corner of the secondary terminal, its 4-line inscription still catching the light with quiet menace. Holmes moved past it. He took his position before the primary screen without a word. The discovery in Marisol's meditation bag and Priya Anand's trembling admission about the encrypted document titles had given the operations center a different weight tonight, the kind that pressed against the walls and made the low-frequency hum of the servers feel like something breathing. His silhouette cut sharp against the cool blue glow as he pulled up the canopy walkway sensor archive for the previous evening, the data stream continuous and precise to the millisecond. At 6:38 p.m., he stilled the stylus, circling a 4-second window where 3 guests had traversed the suspended bridge. The logs showed clean entries, all identities verified, yet something about the rhythm of their footfalls felt manufactured. He advanced to 6:42 p.m. and found another cluster of movement, equally perfect in its documentation. With deliberate slowness, he circled this second window twice more before setting the stylus down on the desk with a soft click. Watson watched from the secondary terminal, noting the 3 distinct circles around each timestamp, receiving no explanation as Holmes advanced to the next entry. Dr. Watson stepped into the side office adjacent to the server room where Sylvester Chua waited with an air of practiced calm that did not quite reach his eyes. The man placed a tablet on the metal table, face up, displaying 5 messages sent to Marisol Aquino Reyes in her final hours. "They will not hesitate if you transmit," the last message read, stark and ominous against the white background. Watson asked Sylvester to walk him through each entry while he listened for the micro-tremors of deception that often betrayed a lie. The financial expert explained that he had received intelligence from an unnamed contact suggesting the order knew Marisol's transmission timeline and was urging her to delay for safety reasons. He insisted these were warnings, not threats, yet his voice remained flat as he recounted how she refused to wait. "She told me she was sending it regardless," Sylvester said, holding Watson's gaze while something raw and frightened worked at the corner of his mouth. "She said the window was already open." Watson logged the thread in his journal, unable to determine if this was truth or the most plausible lie available. Datuk Razif bin Harun entered the operations center with a personal assistant at his side, the man's tablet open to fuel allocation charts. The older man spoke with measured authority about generator priorities and backup satellite uplinks, treating the crisis as merely another logistical hurdle for his team to clear. Holmes let him talk. He waited until the Datuk turned toward him, expecting a polite dismissal, then asked an idle question about how the resort wellness AI managed health profile access during family group bookings. Razif answered promptly, tone flat and unguarded. Family-linked accounts shared a single session token for scheduling convenience, he explained, with dormant sessions remaining valid for up to 72 hours unless manually reset. He delivered this with the easy fluency of a man whose family had used the system for decades, entirely unaware he had just handed Holmes a critical vulnerability. Watson watched his partner's face closely but found nothing there beyond a mask of polite interest. Sylvester Chua leaned back in his chair as Watson prepared to leave the side office, his posture shifting from defensive to resigned. "I tried to keep her safe," Sylvester murmured, tapping the screen where the Oracle messages glowed. "But she thought I was part of it." He stood slowly, smoothing the front of his shirt with hands that trembled just slightly. Watson noted this physical tic and added a final observation in his log before stepping back into the corridor. The ambiguity of the man's intent settled into the space between them without resolution, leaving deduction no clear foothold. As Watson moved toward the main terminal area, he recalled the amber brooch found in Marisol's bag and wondered if Sylvester had recognized it during their earlier encounter. Ahmad Fadzila called out from behind the desk just as Holmes and Watson turned to leave the operations center. The systems administrator held up a printed notification with confusion etched into his features. Caspian Yo, who held no standing in the IT department, had submitted a formal request to audit and correct sensor calibration records from the previous evening, citing a possible system irregularity. Holmes stood motionless for 3 full seconds while the rain lashed against the high windows outside. He turned slowly to Watson with an expression that finally allowed a sliver of cold calculation to show. "He is trying to cover what he has already covered," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying through the hum of the servers. "Which means he does not know we have seen the uncorrected version." He glanced at the dashboard where the request blinked in red. "The backup buffer access approval clears in 12 hours. We should assume Caspian knows that too." Sylvester Chua sat at the console, his fingers moving with a surgeon's precision that belied his youth. He did not search for the canopy walkway logs. He simply typed in 2 segment IDs from memory and hit enter. The screen refreshed instantly, displaying the 4-second windows Holmes had flagged as anomalies hours ago. Sylvester corrected the calibration data in 4 keystrokes, his breathing steady, his jaw loose and unhurried, the face of a technician closing a support ticket rather than a man erasing proof of murder. He exported the file with a soft chime from the speakers and stood up to thank Ahmad Fadzila before turning toward the door. Holmes watched him go, his own left hand resting on a secondary keyboard hidden beneath the desk's lower shelf, having mirrored every keystroke Sylvester made without ever touching the main screen. The silence in the operations center felt heavy with unspoken knowledge as the young IT specialist vanished into the corridor. Ahmad remained at the terminal while Holmes recorded the exact segment IDs and the timestamp of the correction file on a small notepad tucked inside his jacket pocket. He noted the export time, 16,047, precise to the second. The rain hammered against the sealed ceiling vents above, creating a rhythmic drumming that seemed to isolate them from the rest of the resort. Sylvester had navigated directly to the crime scene data without browsing or querying, as if he knew exactly where the lies were buried before he even sat down. Holmes closed his notebook with a sharp snap and stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the humming server racks behind him. He looked at Ahmad, then toward the door Sylvester had just exited through, and said nothing. Dr. Watson pushed open the heavy steel door of the infrastructure closet, where the air smelled of recycled oxygen and warm aluminium fins. Hafiz stood before a ruggedized tablet connected directly to the edge computing rack, his fingers flying across the touch interface as he isolated the raw backup buffer from 3 days prior. They filtered for Medallion R07, the device registered to Datuk Razif bin Harun between 14R on the 16th on the day of Marisol's death. 2 rows appeared in stark white text against a black background, marking proximity logs that Sylvester's audit had never touched because they were written after the correction file was exported. Watson leaned closer to read the timestamps, while Hafiz pointed out the 12-minute window where Razif's device lingered just 40 meters from Villa Canopy 4. Watson said nothing. He took the printout from the thermal printer, folded it once along the short edge, and slipped it into his pocket. The data showed a presence that matched the time of the epinephrine swap perfectly, yet Sylvester had corrected records for an earlier period entirely. He thanked Hafiz and stepped back out into the corridor. Humidity rose against his skin like a physical weight. Rain lashed the glass walls of the walkway outside, blurring the green canopy into a wash of dark emerald and gray mist. He found Holmes standing near the rear exit where the covered path began, watching the storm with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something beyond the weather. Holmes took the folded paper from Watson's hand without asking for it, reading the first line once, then again as his lips compressed into a thin, hard line. He turned to Ahmad Fadzila, who had followed them out and now stood dripping wet on the tiled floor of the covered walkway. "Confirm when Sylvester exported that correction file," Holmes said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the sound of the rain. Ahmad consulted his tablet before looking up with a frown. He confirmed the export, timestamped at 16,047, while the backup buffer completed its final local sync cycle 4 minutes later at 1651. Holmes nodded slowly, folding the printout along its existing crease until it was small enough to fit in his palm. He looked up from the paper and met Watson's gaze. His eyes held the flat recognition of a man who had watched evidence disappear before. He filed the audit request before the backup buffer completed its sync cycle, Holmes said quietly, the words barely rising above the drumming rain overhead. He didn't know it existed. He opened the printout one more time to stare at the 15,012 timestamp marking Razif's proximity to Marisol's villa during the critical window. Then he looked out at the blurred tree line where the storm was breaking through the canopy in sheets of white water. "Neither did I," Holmes added. Watson noted later that night that this was the first time his partner had admitted surprise since they arrived. Holmes stood before the matte black terminal at the Wellness Pavilion reception node, his silhouette sharp against the cold face of the offline screen. Rain hammered the thatched overhang outside the sliding doors. It was relentless, isolating them from the rest of the resort like a wall of white noise. Ahmad Fadzila hovered nearby, clutching an authorization tablet with hands that trembled slightly as he handed over credentials for deep system access. Holmes did not thank him. His focus stayed absolute on the query interface, where 6 session tokens blinked in a list of digital ghosts. 5 were active, time-stamped within the last 3 days, and linked to staff or Marisol's own profile. The 6th was different. It sat marked dormant, carrying the aura of something deliberately neglected, inactive for 14 months, registered under Harun Razif Amirul, Datuk Razif's son, as part of a family wellness plan that should have expired long ago. He tapped the screen to retrieve the last data query performed by the dormant token. The characters resolved into a date and time, 14 March 2028 at 14,000 19 minutes before Marisol's scheduled spa check-in. Asked Ahmad to pull the booking confirmation for that specific session. Ahmad swiped through menus on his own tablet, the blue light catching in his eyes as he navigated the reservation system with growing urgency. 2 minutes and 8 seconds. That was the gap between the dormant token query and the check-in logged at 15,047, a timestamp that appeared on Ahmad's screen moments later. Holmes did not speak. He simply requested both records printed on thermal paper, watching them curl out of the slot like thin strips of evidence. Upstairs in the resort library, the air smelled of old teak oil and dust trapped between heavy volumes of regional natural history. Dr. Watson sat across from Dr. Priya Anand at a central reading table illuminated by a single warm lamp that cast long shadows against the shelves. She held a cold cup of coffee with both hands, her posture stripped of its usual professional armor as she stared into the dark liquid. Watson leaned forward slightly, his questions arriving unhurried and blunt-edged, calibrated to encourage her without pressing too hard on the wound Marisol had left behind. Priya finally spoke about the 18 months Marisol spent building an evidentiary case against a networked criminal organization known only as the Amber Group, describing it with the hollow precision of someone who had processed too much truth to feel it any longer. The amber brooch was no trinket. She explained it was a physical membership credential for the Order of the Amber Throne, obtained through a contact inside the very network Marisol had intended to expose. Priya reached into her pocket and produced a cached file fragment from her handler copy of Marisol's notes, sliding it across the table toward Watson, where he could see references to a Malaysian political figure and a cash payment architecture designed to launder billions. She told him Marisol had confessed something on the morning she died. Not fear of any single man, terror of missing a deadline. 16 March, Manila. Watson drew out his UV-equipped tablet and held it over the brooch, which he had brought from evidence storage, watching as the ultraviolet beam resolved a partial glyph structure that matched the formatting Marisol had documented. Holmes entered the library a moment later, carrying 2 folded printouts, without greeting Priya or acknowledging the tension in the room. He walked to the table and placed both documents side by side under the reading lamp, aligning them with surgical precision so the timestamps faced each other like opposing witnesses. The Wellness AI session token query at 14,005 and 8,000 lay on the right, separated by a gap of 2 minutes and 8 seconds that seemed to stretch across the wood grain. Holmes looked down at them without inflection and stated simply that the man had not improvised. He had a schedule, and that schedule required knowing her allergen profile before she walked through those doors. Priya stared at the timestamps, her index finger tracing the 2-minute gap between them. As the shape of it resolved, the killer had confirmed his target's presence remotely, rather than waiting to see if she would arrive. She stood up slowly, murmuring an excuse about needing air before turning and walking out of the library into the rain-swept corridor where the sound of falling water filled the silence she left behind. Watson remained seated, staring at that 2-minute gap long enough to confirm a route, short enough that there had been no hesitation in committing to the act. He opened his journal to a clean page and wrote the date and time with a steady hand before stopping mid-sentence as he reached for the name of the man who had orchestrated it all. The pen hovered over the paper, trembling slightly as Watson realized that writing the name meant accepting a reality in which Datuk Razif bin Harun was not just a grieving patriarch but an executioner. Outside the library windows, the rain continued to fall on the dark canopy of the Langkawi forest, washing away footprints and evidence in equal measure, while the Geopark Road lay submerged and the island offered no exit. Ahmad Fadzilla stood by the stainless steel counter while Watson spread Nalini Ravindran's handwritten allergen journal under the harsh LED banks of the kitchen prep station. Nalini pointed to a specific entry dated the 14th, her finger tracing the ink as she explained that prawn protein from staff meal B had contaminated the shared chopping block before the dedicated allergen zone was reset. 3 junior cooks confirmed the timeline independently. No conferring, no hesitation. Their voices were steady and factual as they recounted the sequence involving the foraging knife and lemongrass mincing. Watson photographed every page of the logbook, while Nalini insisted that she would never permit an unlabeled utensil near a designated preparation area, her tone sharp with professional indignation. The shrimp protein on the blade was from 2 days prior. It cleared her of negligence regarding the immediate murder weapon. Yet when Ahmad pulled up the access logs for the cold press station where the Kare-Kare Annatto oil sat sealed and separate, Watson noticed a 7-minute gap in the pre-service window that remained unattributed and unmarked by any staff member. Watson followed the kitchen waste path through the narrow service corridor to the rear of the main pavilion, where the overnight monsoon runoff had left a muddy residue line on the concrete wall at knee height. The drain grate was clogged with leaf matter and dark sediment. His forensic penlight caught a glint of glass beneath the debris, glass that did not belong in a culinary environment. He crouched low and used tweezers to extract a small pipette, medical grade and approximately 8 centimeters long, with a clear glass barrel and a polymer tip designed for precision fluid transfer. A faint amber-brown residue coated the interior wall of the tube when he held it up to the light, suggesting a substance far more complex than kitchen stock. He bagged the item, labeled it, photographed the grate's position relative to the service door, then cross-referenced his inventory photos from day one. This was no dropped tool. Someone had brought this surgical instrument in from outside and discarded it where they believed the monsoon would wash away every last trace. In the quiet of his villa, Holmes sat at his desk with the amber brooch secured in a polymer tray, the portable forensic scanner humming softly as it processed the UV inscription hash through an encrypted uplink. The resort's satellite relay was partially restored, but slow. 11 minutes passed before a partial match from the distributed blockchain registry resolved on his screen. What appeared was a Cayman Islands registered investment consortium with a tokenization protocol dating back to 2024, cross-referenced against a 2026 Malaysian infrastructure governance filing that listed 3 signatory names as suppressed pending full trace resolution. Holmes noted the registration date matched a pattern from prior briefs on carbon credit laundering schemes, though he saved the result without sharing it yet with Watson or Priya. He reached for his tea. A knock came at the door just then, breaking his concentration and forcing him to look up from the display that connected Marisol's death to something far larger than a resort murder. Florian Wessels stood in the doorway wearing a damp linen shirt that clung to his shoulders as though he had been waiting outside for some time before deciding to knock. He entered without sitting, measuring each word as though the information cost him something to release, and explained that the brooch served as Marisol's insurance policy against her own disappearance or death. If she failed to check in with a contact at a Manila NGO every 72 hours, the brooch's serial number and all linked document bundles would automatically transmit to their servers. Holmes asked precisely when her last check-in had occurred, and Florian stated that it was 31 hours ago, speaking as a man naming a fact he had been carrying alone for too long. The naturalist looked at the closed forensic scanner screen with eyes that held no grief now but only a cold, considered fear of what those documents might reveal once they were released to the world. Holmes turned from the scanner and fixed his attention on Florian, noting how the man's hands trembled slightly despite his attempt at composure. He told Watson over an open line that tomorrow morning they would speak to Sylvester Chua, not as a suspect, but as the one man on this island who may have tried to stop what happened before he failed. Holmes needed to understand why Chua's oracle messages mentioned a governance vote, and he required that knowledge before the full blockchain trace resolved the remaining signatory names. He left the forensic scanner running overnight while outside. The floodwater had dropped 6 centimeters since noon, leaving behind only mud and silence where the storm had spent itself. The blockchain trace returned its final result at 6:05 a.m., casting a cold blue glow across the long reading table in the resort library. Holmes stared at the screen where 4 lines of alphanumeric credentials had resolved into a membership token issued by the Order of the Amber Throne. The registry cross-referenced 3 Malaysian infrastructure contracts totaling 2.3 billion ringgit, each listing the Tun Razif bin Harun as a governance signatory for issuances spanning 2024 to 2027. Watson read the figures twice before opening his journal, his pen moving with deliberate strokes to document the evidentiary chain, serial number, inscription decode, and bond issuance cross-references. Holmes said nothing for 40 seconds while the rain tapped a steady rhythm against the high windows. The motive was no longer circumstantial, it was prosecutorial. Sylvester Chua arrived as requested, his composure fraying at the edges despite years of practice in hiding such things. Holmes placed the blockchain printout on the table before mentioning the coded message thread, watching Sylvester's hands settle flat against the wood when he saw the token registry number. The man's professional mask cracked just enough to reveal a raw recognition that no performance could fake. "You have her brooch," Sylvester said, his voice stripped of its usual smooth modulation. "We do," Holmes replied. When the encrypted messages appeared next, Sylvester read them and exhaled a long, compressed breath. "Those were coded updates to my lawyer about an extraction attempt," he explained without prompting. "I tried to reach Marisol for 48 hours before her death to pass her the internal governance documents I had retained, but never got close enough to say a single useful word." With the coded thread closed and Sylvester now speaking freely, Holmes asked one precise question: who watched the Order's operational environment on this island? "Caspian Yo is not IT staff," Sylvester answered immediately, his eyes dropping to the table as if confessing treason. "He knew everything. He is the Order's eyes here, every sensor, every network packet. He sees it before anyone else does." His voice steadied as he pressed on. "If someone needed to know whether Marisol had transmitted her files, Caspian would have known it before she closed her laptop." Watson wrote the name in his journal and underlined it once. He noted how Sylvester's relief at being cleared was genuine, while his fear of what came next remained tangible. The red herring dissolved as Sylvester detailed the governance documents he had tried to pass on. Holmes left Watson to finalize the formal witness statement with Ahmad Fadzila and walked alone toward the operations center behind the main pavilion. He pulled Caspian Yo's staff access log for the night of the murder, scanning until he landed on a login timestamp at 11:47 p.m., 40 minutes after the last sensor record, placing Razif in the main pavilion. Caspian had remained logged in for 36 minutes before signing out. Holmes initiated an autocorrelation analysis on the canopy walkway sensor segments he had identified earlier, then fixed his gaze on the screen as the processing bars began to fill. He waited until Ahmad arrived, then delivered his instructions with cold precision. "I want Caspian Yo in the conference room at 7 tomorrow morning," Holmes said. "Tell him the report flagged an anomaly in his correction file and that I need his technical assistance." Ahmad asked on what grounds they were summoning a staff member so late into the night. "Curiosity," Holmes replied, his gaze fixed on the terminal where the analysis bars continued to climb. His. He turned toward Watson, who checked his watch, 11:19 p.m. The autocorrelation was running now, processing terabytes of motion sensor history through algorithms designed to find patterns invisible to human eyes. Outside, for the first time since landfall, the wind had dropped to silence beneath the hum of servers. Watson closed his journal and looked at the screen where Caspian Yo's name glowed in red against the dark interface. The case was no longer about a single murder, but an empire built on lies, and they were finally ready to tear it down. hum of the cooling fans filled the pre-dawn operations center, a low drone that seemed to settle in Holmes's teeth as he stared at the waveform display. 847 identically compressed frames marched across the screen in a row of flat green spikes, mechanically identical where organic sensor data should have shown micro-variation. It was the digital equivalent of a skipping record, a loop so perfect it betrayed its own artificiality to anyone who understood how noise behaved in nature. Watson entered with 2 cups from the pavilion urn, steam curling into the cool air, and stopped when he saw the expression on Holmes's face. There was no satisfaction there, only the stillness of a man confirming a shape he had already known for days. Ahmad Fadzilla stepped up behind them to read the printout over Holmes's shoulder, his brow creasing as the implications settled in. 847 identically compressed frames in sequence, Holmes said without turning from the screen. No camera produces that, not a calibration artifact. It is a signature. Watson set the coffee down untouched on the console and opened his own terminal to begin the next phase of work. Watson cross-referenced the burner device MAC address against the resort's secondary Wi-Fi band traffic records, filtering for any handshake requests prior to the murder date. The system flagged a single ping 17 days before Marisol died, time-stamped precisely to a systems audit roster that listed Caspian Yo as the sole assigned technician for that shift. It was a small data point, easily missed without this specific query, but it placed the device on the network weeks before any crime was conceived. He requested Ahmad's emergency data share authorization for the Kuah Municipal CCTV archive, citing active homicide investigation status to bypass standard clearance protocols. The response arrived in 11 minutes, a raw feed that required manual filtering by the SIM activation timestamp Watson had isolated from the network logs. One usable frame emerged from the static, a man in a plain gray shirt at a convenience mart counter paying cash for a sealed package before tucking it under his arm and vanishing into the crowd. The resolution was sufficient for a positive identification if one knew where to look. Watson printed the image and carried it to Holmes without speaking, sliding the paper across the desk with a deliberate tap. Holmes looked at the photo for 2 seconds, then stood and smoothed his jacket. "Call Ahmad," he said simply. "We need the office." Caspian Yo arrived 40 minutes later, brought by security into the manager's private suite, where rain lashed against the glass walls of the Datai main building. He sat with the practiced posture of a man who had rehearsed composure under questioning, hands folded neatly on the table before him. Holmes placed 3 items on the surface in sequence: the autocorrelation printout showing the looped sensor data, the MAC address timeline proving early network access, and the convenience mart CCTV frame capturing Caspian buying the burner phone. Caspian examined each in turn, his eyes flicking from paper to face without registering panic yet. "The waveform is a known compression artifact," he said finally, his voice steady but thin. "From the January firmware update." Holmes placed the firmware timestamp beside the printout with a sharp click. 14 months ago versus 9 months for the codec used in the loop, the dates were irreconcilable mathematically. Caspian tried again to deflect, claiming the MAC address match was coincidental, as thousands of devices shared that range. Watson opened his notebook to reveal the network fingerprint analysis he had compiled, unique across 6 parameters, including channel bonding signature and beacon interval, making coincidence impossible. A long silence fell over the room, 3 distinct digital trails converging on one man. Caspian's shoulders dropped by perhaps 3 centimeters, a subtle shift that marked the moment his composure finally gave way. He looked at Holmes and asked quietly whether any arrangement was available to avoid further proceedings before federal officers arrived. "That is a question for them," Holmes replied, checking the weather forecast on his tablet. "They will arrive when the Geopark Road clears, approximately 3 hours from now, based on current storm intensity." Rain-damp wood and cold coffee filled the resort library as dawn approached on the 4th day. 3 federal officers sat across from Holmes and Watson, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of laptop screens, displaying a unified evidentiary package. Holmes laid out the sequence with clinical precision. First, the contact tracing proximity record, placing Razif's biosensor 40 meters from Villa 7 at 3017 p.m., while Marisol checked into her spa appointment. Second, the Wellness AI session token queried 19 minutes before the epinephrine swap window, using a burner MAC address traced to a cash purchase in Kuah. Third, the autocorrelation analysis revealing 847 pixel identical frames, proving Caspian fabricated the canopy walkway sensor loop. Watson slid the blockchain forensic summary across the table as the final exhibit, the amber brooch serving as a governance key for the Order of the Amber Throne, linked to 2.3 billion ringgit in fraudulent infrastructure bonds with Razif listed as signatory on 3 issuances. The lead officer scanned the documents without looking up and asked if the confession was clean enough to hold. Holmes confirmed it consisted of 4 hours of recorded statement backed by parallel written corroboration from Caspian Yo, whose role as Razif's IT operative had been fully exposed through his access logs and CCTV footage showing him purchasing the burner phone. The main lobby at 5049 a.m. held a gray light filtering through the entrance archway. Datuk Razif bin Harun descended the staircase in a linen shirt, moving with the unhurried bearing of a man accustomed to being the most composed presence in any room he entered. He saw the federal officers positioned near the base of the stairs and then spotted Holmes standing by the reception alcove with both hands in his coat pockets. Razif paused on the 3rd step from the bottom and held the look for exactly 3 seconds, an expression Watson recognized not as defiance or fear, but as something older, a man who had arrived at a destination he had long known was inevitable. The officers approached from left and right while Razif descended the final steps and stopped with his hands open at his sides. He did not speak or resist as they moved in. Watson watched from the library corridor, his notebook closed against his chest, understanding that some moments were more accurately carried than recorded. Watson wrote his journal entry that evening from his villa, windows open to the cooling forest air, accounting for every thread of the investigation now drawn tight. Caspian Yo had been transferred to federal custody at 6005 a.m. after his confession was formally entered into the prosecutorial record. Sylvester Chua provided structural testimony on the order's hierarchy over 3 hours in the library, looking relieved in the way a man looks when he finally sets down a burden too heavy to carry alone. Dr. Priya Anand departed on an early flight to Kuala Lumpur after Marisol's encrypted file transfer was initiated from the resort uplink, ensuring the mission Marisol had died to protect would reach Manila. Florian Wessels vanished before sunrise, leaving no forwarding contact behind, though housekeeping logs confirmed a single white orchid appeared on his terrace that morning, with no record of placement by staff or guests. The amber brooch now sat in a federal evidence seal, en route via diplomatic courier to the NGO Marisol had been trying to reach. Watson recorded how Razif had looked crossing the lobby, less like a man facing prison than someone who had just lost something he could not name but had long known he would lose. The specific reason Holmes and Watson remained at the resort despite their cover story was now clear. They were tracking a string of deaths connected to financial fraud across Southeast Asia that Marisol's notes had finally linked to this location. The shrimp protein found on Nalini's blade was explained by Caspian's deliberate contamination during his shift, while the medical-grade pipette recovered from the drainage grate contained residue matching the amber compound used in the brooch's casting, which traced the fraud network back through its shell companies. Outside Watson's window, the rainforest canopy caught the first green light of morning, a hue so vivid it made the forest appear as though it had never known anything other than this quiet continuation. The evidence Marisol had been killed to suppress would arrive in Manila precisely because her murder generated the forensic record proving its existence. Razif destroyed her life only to ensure his own downfall arrived in the very package he had tried to stop. Watson closed the journal and watched the light deepen across the trees, understanding that justice did not always feel like triumph, but sometimes simply felt like something finally moving forward. Rain tapped against the veranda glass in a steady rhythm that had replaced the frantic urgency of the last few days. Holmes stood by the railing, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the wet teak floorboards as he watched the storm clouds gather over the canopy. He held a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago, the steam long since lost to the humid air. Watson approached slowly, his boots making no sound on the polished surface, and leaned against the opposite rail. "It is quiet now," Holmes said, not turning from the view. The silence felt heavier than it should, freighted with the presence of people who had spoken their last words somewhere in this building. He set the cup down on a small table beside the evidence bags already packed for transfer to Kuala Lumpur. Something in Holmes's bearing had shifted. His shoulders dropped an inch, as if releasing a tension he had carried since finding Marisol Aquino Reyes in her chair. "Florian Wessels asked me about the forest this morning," Watson said, shifting his weight toward the tree line where the dipterocarp giants stood motionless against the gray sky. The naturalist had been worried about the encroachment logs Marisol had accessed before her death, fearing they would be lost in the chaos of the investigation. "He thinks his notes are gone," Watson continued, watching Holmes's profile for a reaction. The detective finally turned, his sharp eyes catching the light with that familiar, rapid flicker of calculation. Holmes crossed to where Watson stood and placed a hand on the railing, tracing the wood grain with one finger. "The logs were never in danger," he said, his voice clear above the rain. Caspian Yo had routed all data through a local server before deleting it from the cloud, a move that preserved the physical drives Wessels kept in his cabin. The naturalist's fear was misplaced. The evidence of Heron Resources' illegal logging existed independently of Marisol's digital notes. "He can sleep now," Holmes added, turning back to Watson with a faint, tired smile. It was a small victory measured against the billions uncovered and the man arrested in the lobby, but it mattered for those who lived among the trees. Watson nodded, and felt the case release its hold on him by degrees. He thought of Marisol's encrypted messages and how they had pulled Holmes and himself through a labyrinth of corporate greed and older, darker rituals to this quiet moment on the veranda. "We should go," he said, glancing at his watch for the first time in hours. The rain was picking up again, drumming harder against the roof tiles as if eager to wash the place clean. Holmes lifted his coat from a nearby chair, draped it over one arm, and walked toward the door back into the main pavilion. They stepped out together under an awning where two federal officers waited, engines idling in the wet evening air. The officer who opened Watson's door gave him a short nod, the kind that said more than it showed. Holmes slid into the back seat without a word. The doors closed. The sound of the rain was sealed away behind them, and with it the resort, shrinking in the rearview mirror until the last lights dissolved into the dark.